All right, now talking about ecosystems. The global energy budget is a term that relates to the amount of solar radiation impacting the Earth's surface and actually being taken in by photosynthetic organisms. So there's a whole lot of light that hits the Earth. Only a fraction of that hits the green plant life on the Earth. And of that light, only some of it is usable. So only red and bluish light is used for photosynthesis. But of the light energy that is taken in by plants, it is then passed on to primary consumers. And what I want to show you is that when an organism eats plant material, only a fraction of it is converted to biomass. Here's this word biomass. That means actual growth or reproduction in that organism. So adding to actual mass, living mass of that organism. So if there is a leaf here that who knows how much energy is in that leaf, but if 200 joules of energy are eaten by the caterpillar, roughly half of that will be lost as feces and not assimilated into the next level of the biological hierarchy. Instead, it is eaten by detritivores, and the energy is essentially lost as heat, and it's gone forever. Around 67% of that energy is used for cellular respiration. Okay, so it's brought into the organism, but it's used to run cell respiration, making ATP, and therefore that energy is essentially then lost as heat. Meanwhile, about 33 joules out of all of that is actually going to go into new biomass, new cells, new tissues, or reproduction. And that then is the energy that might be passed on to the next level of the hierarchy if that caterpillar is eaten by a tertiary or a secondary consumer or something like that. So notice how so much of the energy at this primary level is lost, and only a small fraction of it goes on to the next possible level of the hierarchy. Now, the term production efficiency is utilized in the book. Production efficiency is how efficient is the conversion of food to biomass in a particular organism or part of the biological hierarchy there. Now, let's look at some production efficiencies. Birds and mammals are only 1 to 3% efficient, because a whole bunch of our energy goes into endothermy, keeping us warm through cellular respiration. Fish can hold on to about 10% of the energy they consume and turn it into biomass. Insects sometimes, and microorganisms sometimes, can be up to 40% or so effective at holding on to biomass. So the production efficiency is pretty high. But if we look at this from a tropic level, so by tropic I mean tropic levels are primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, so on. Those are the tropic levels, how energy and materials flow through an ecosystem. With each tropic level, the transfer of energy overall is only roughly about 10% efficient. Okay, so as you go from one level to the next, only 10% of the energy is transferred to the next level. And remember that energy enters as light and it leaves as heat. That's how energy, so energy flows through an ecosystem, comes in as light and it leaves as heat. So if we see this, here's 1,000,000 joules of sunlight energy. Only 1/100th of that is absorbed by plants. That's your global energy budget, basically. And then if this plant is eaten by primary consumers, only 10% of that ends up as biomass in this group, and only 10% of that ends up in secondary consumers, and only 10% of that will end up in tertiary consumers. So this is why there are only a few big predators, top predators in an environment, because there's not enough energy left at the top of that those tropic levels to fuel more large predators, because there's a loss of energy as you move up. So what this tells us is that for every 1,000,000 joules of sunlight that hit this environment, there's only 10 joules available for tertiary consumers. Now, this is a question, why do we need the following? carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. So we talked about energy. Energy flows through an ecosystem and then is lost as heat and is lost as we move up the hierarchy. But chemicals like carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen, they cycle through the environment. They're recycled. Notice, like in this case, we have a bag of fertilizer like you might use in your garden, and it has numbers on it that indicate nitrogen, potassium, which we're not going to worry about so much today, and phosphate. These are two very important ones. So you might ask yourself from Bio 1, why is carbon important? I'll give you a clue. We're carbon-based life forms. But why is phosphorus important? What is it used for? Ask yourself that. What is nitrogen for? You should know. You should be able to figure it out. You should know from thinking about chemicals why these are important. And I'll keep in mind, let's start with nitrogen. Nitrogen is 78% of the atmosphere. So there's tons of nitrogen, whereas like CO2's less than 1%, right? And oxygen's 21%. So all of this nitrogen is available, but it's not usable by organisms or by most organisms. So nitrogen actually has to be fixed, meaning pulled out of the atmosphere and turned into a solid form. So if we look at the nitrogen cycle, notice once again, nothing is lost here. Like in heat, heat radiates out into space, increasing the entropy of the universe. But that doesn't happen with chemicals. With chemicals, there's a cycle. Nitrogen in the atmosphere gets fixed or turned into a usable form in aquatic systems as well as in terrestrial systems. Here's an increased view of the terrestrial system. So bear in mind that plants, like the family legumes, Legumes, you should write that down, the legumes, the bean plants, they have nodes in their roots that are houses for nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Don't confuse that for mycorrhizae. Mycorrhizae are fungi that do something else. But nitrogen-fixing bacteria live in the roots of some plants. They help to pull nitrogen out of the air and turn it into forms that plants can use. And there are other bacteria that can convert from one form to another, but the two forms that plants directly use are shown here. Ammonium, and then also here we have nitrates. So those forms are usable directly by plants, but bacteria can also take nitrates and convert them back into gaseous nitrogen in the atmosphere. Notice when these plants die, they decompose and they release their nitrogen into the ground. When animals eat plants, they get some of their nitrogen. When they die, they are broken down as well and release their nitrogen. So your nitrogen is constantly cycling through the environment. And you can read some of this yourself, but important. Why is this important? Well, nitrogen is part of ammonia, which is where your amino acids come from. Amino acids got the word ammonia in it, right? Amino acids, of course, then therefore proteins. We also have nitrogen involved in nucleic acids as well, like DNA and RNA. Plants use ammonium and nitrate. I'm not going to worry about nitrite right now, but those two are used directly by plants. This is why we have nitrogen in our fertilizer. This nitrogen, the nitrogen reservoirs, you might think of them as the sources of nitrogen, are the atmosphere, the soils, rocks, as well as organisms. And some of the big things that happen are fixation, carbon fixation. That's when atmospheric nitrogen is converted to ammonium, which can also be converted to nitrate and used by plants. The carbon cycle. This one's really important. The carbon cycle involves the movement of carbon through the environment. Some of it is stored in rocks and things, of course, as well, when animals die and get buried and fossilize and things. But carbon is released by plants and animals through cellular respiration into the atmosphere. The burning of fossil fuels releases carbon into the atmosphere. Photosynthesis absorbs carbon back into plants. And if they die and get buried, then they become carbon sinks. So even a living tree is a carbon sink, meaning it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere and holds on to it. Of course, when things die and decompose, that releases their carbon back into the atmosphere as well. So all organic molecules are carbon-based. This is a very important molecule. And the reservoirs of this, of course, where it's locked in and where we get it from, fossil fuels are heavy in carbon, soils and sediments as well. In our own biomass, there's tons of carbon. There's carbon in the atmosphere. There's even carbon in all the limestone of the world, the sedimentary rocks. And you're already familiar with some of the key processes involved in this cycle. Photosynthesis takes up CO2. Respiration gives off CO2. Fossil fuels release CO2. Burning of wood does as well. And volcanic activity can release carbon dioxide gas. All right, now I just want to mention, I'm not going to go into this one much, but I do want to mention another important chemical is phosphorus. And why is phosphorus important? It's involved in nucleic acids, phosphate groups, and phospholipids, ATP also. And once again, this is another molecule that will cycle through the environment from one organism to another and into the rocks and into the earth and back again. It's a cycle. It's not. It doesn't flow. It cycles through the environment. Now, carbon dioxide gas is an important one to keep our eyes on because we know that there's a direct relationship with increases in atmospheric carbon, CO2 in the atmosphere, and global temperatures. And what we can tell is that what happens is CO2 acts kind of like a blanket. Sunlight comes into the earth. Typically, it hits the earth, warms it up, and a whole lot of that light bounces back off into space. And some of that light, of course, warms the earth. The earth is warmed by radiation. You know about that term now. Then the earth is warm, and then it radiates heat off into space, and a lot of it is lost into space forever. But what CO2 does is it bounces some of this heat back down to the earth and keeps it from escaping as quickly, and that warms the atmosphere. So it traps heat. It acts like a blanket over the planet's surface. And you might ask yourself, well, is this warming that we see, is it actually caused by humans? Well, let me give you a little bit of evidence for this. The atmosphere naturally contains carbon-12 as well as the isotope carbon-14. Carbon-14 decays at a known rate, and therefore, so it changes from carbon into nitrogen actually. But fossil fuels, because they're so old, do not have any carbon-14 left. So when we burn when we burn fossil fuels, it only releases carbon-12, okay? Not carbon-14. Now, forest fires will release carbon-12 and 14, for example, okay? Because it's living plants that are burning, or just recently dead plants. Now, when we look at the atmosphere and we sample what's accumulating in the atmosphere, only carbon-12 is accumulating. We don't see a big buildup of carbon-14. And the only other known source of carbon-12 are volcanoes. And when we look at all the emissions from volcanoes, it's less than 1% of the CO2 in the atmosphere. But at the same time, we know that humans emit 29 billion tons of CO2 every single year. We estimate that the ocean can only absorb about 6 billion tons a year, and vegetation about 11 billion tons a year. The rest of that surplus CO2, stays in the atmosphere. And when we use a spectrometer, like a photospectrometer like you used in Bio 1 to look at absorbance of light, we can see what wavelengths of light are being absorbed and which wavelengths are being reflected by the atmosphere. And we can easily see then that the warming of the Earth is mostly caused by CO2. There are other gases that are problems too that we're emitting, but we're really releasing a lot of carbon dioxide. So we can tell that that carbon dioxide is from a human source. It's carbon-12. It's from fossil fuel burning. And we can see in the spectrometer that it is absorbing a lot of energy, a lot of heat, and reflecting it back down to Earth. We can see it. So there's no guessing here. It's the nail's in the coffin. It's clearly us causing the problem. I'm skipping these videos here. You can watch them on your own. Lastly, I want to say that we often spray fertilizers on the planet to help increase crop yields and things. So we're spreading nitrogen and phosphorus and things like that. But the problem with that is a lot of it leaches into the environment. And so off the Gulf of Mexico, we have nitrogen accumulating like crazy. And we know nitrogen is necessary for plant growth and for algal growth. It's part of amino acids, right? And when it's a limiting factor. If you don't have a lot of nitrogen around, things don't grow. But if you have a ton of it around, things often grow like crazy. And so what happens off the coast here, where the Mississippi River dumps into the ocean, tons of fertilizer washes into the ocean from all the farm fields in Arkansas and everywhere else, and it fertilizes the ocean. Then plankton goes crazy, and they grow like crazy. There's tons of plankton, but they grow in cycles where their population increases and then it crashes. And when their population crashes, they die, they rot, and rotting uses up oxygen. And then this whole area becomes a dead zone where fish can't live because all the oxygen is depleted from the water, causing massive problems. And of course, there are other issues with nitrogen runoff. Here's the lake by my parents' home in Ohio. It gets cyanobacteria blooms, and these cyanobacterial blooms, and they produce a lot of toxins that wipe out fish. It kills dogs that drink out of the lake. All kinds of problems from excess nutrients that caused by human agriculture. Meanwhile, humans are also, their population is exploding at an exponential rate. You can see that here. Here is the year 0, and here is, the year 2000. You can see the population is just skyrocketing as we continue to make more humans, and the Earth will not sustain this for too much longer. So the problem is, what happens now is the human population is growing. We're warming the Earth, things like that. But at the same time, we're destroying habitat. And this leads to extinction, what they call the Extinction Vortex, where populations of animals are small because their habitat's gone. Therefore, they inbreed a lot more. They get a lot more genetic drift, a lot of loss of genetic variability. Remember how important variability is for evolution? They're stressed out, therefore they don't have as many babies. They're less fit because of issues like this and because the climate's changing and things. So they have an even smaller population. And this is driving a lot of organisms to extinction. Biodiversity is threatened due to the growth of the human population and the loss of habitat. And biodiversity, the diversity of biology, can be measured in 3 ways. Genetic diversity, so hopefully we're not all inbred, right? Species diversity, how many species are there, as well as how many different kinds of ecosystems are there and how healthy are they. And there are some major threats to biodiversity. Habitat loss, as we cut down forests to make farms and things. Introduced species like this kudzu in Florida covering everything. So kudzu's introduced from somewhere else. This is a gypsy moth introduced from somewhere else. These cause great damage to our native species. Overharvesting, like overfishing the oceans and things like that, causing species to go extinct or to become endangered. And of course then global change, whether that be climate or whether that be acid rain, massive changes to the globe. All of these things are threats to genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. So, as you'll see in the other video, this loss of habitat has greatly shaped the species that we have and don't have anymore here in the state of Arkansas.